Nutrition Rice, Stories from Japan. I'm Toby.
I'm Andri.
And today we welcome Klepto back to our show. Thank you for coming back again. This
Thank you
time,
so much.
not in a cosplay,
Yes.
just as yourself, but that's for a specific reason because we're not going to talk about cosplay today. You wanted to share with us your experience with the LGBTQ community here in Japan.
Yes.
Which I'm sure we have a lot to talk about, and it's a very timely topic since we are in Pride Month.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me back. I'm happy to be back again so soon. I had a lot of fun talking about cosplay, and I'm happy that this time I can talk about another topic that's important to me.
That was super interesting. And for all of your listeners who haven't heard that episode, please head over and have a listen for yourself. But today I want to talk to you more about this topic of the LGBTQ community, and maybe you can give us a brief overview to start with of what's the status of the community right now, what are the overall rights, and maybe we can then dive deeper into some of the specifics during the episode.
Sounds good. That's a big question to jump into. So, well, let's see. Where should I start with that, I suppose?
Maybe we can give the framework and start with what are the rights for the LGBTQ community in terms of marriage, in terms of being recognized as a couple, same-sex couple or non-gendered couple. We had just a few weeks ago Chari on the podcast, a non-binary transgender person living in Japan, mentioning some of the challenges with this. So maybe you can kind of give us some more insights.
Yes. All right. So, well, Japan still doesn't have marriage equality yet. There's a lot of steps that are being taken towards that. There are some places that have a partnership system. But yeah, overall, there's still no same-sex marriage allowed or non-gendered marriage allowed.
I saw just like a few days ago, we are now, in June 2023, some courts from big cities in Nagoya and Sapporo and what was it, Fukuoka, I think. The courts kind of judged that the fact of not recognizing same-sex marriage is anti-constitutional.
Yes, that was a huge step and something that a lot of activism groups have been fighting for a while now. So I think that was the first time that we've had some of those really big courts. Like I think the first one was Nagoya. That's amazing to see that step forward finally happening, because I think showing that it's against the Japanese Constitution is a good first step towards being able to proceed with actually having laws and things protecting marriage equality.
Like baby steps forward. But the country is still quite far behind, right? In Asia,
Definitely.
Taiwan is usually the role model for kind of taking steps towards equality.
Taiwan is way ahead of most of the rest of Asia, and definitely ahead of Japan in that way.
So from a legal perspective, we know that you've shared that not many rights, it's not really recognized. So you can have your preferences and your beliefs and your feelings, but we won't recognize them. That's basically the stance of the government, just generally speaking.
I think there are a few protections in place to protect against some discrimination, but overall, there's not really that much in place right now. I think Japan is a fairly safe country in just many ways, so there in some ways isn't as much violence or anything towards the LGBTQ community as in some other countries, but there also aren't many protections or laws in place to support the community.
So talking about the community, can you run us through a little bit of what is a community like here in Japan, and perhaps maybe to start with, how is it like in comparison to the United States where you're from?
That's a really good question. I have to say that I'm not sure I'm entirely qualified to answer that. Here in Japan, I think, well, the main thing that I can say about the community here is that there is a community. It seems to be a little bit maybe smaller than in some other countries, just because, Japan is still catching up to some other countries in those ways. The main difference that I've noticed between the community here and the community in America, for example, is that it feels as though the LGBTQ community here in Japan is a little bit more divided. There are a lot of events that are like, they say it's for G only or for L only.
Can you explain what that means?
So because we have the letters of LGBTQ to represent the different groups. So maybe sometimes they'll have events that are only for gay men and other people are not invited to those events.
Interesting. So,
which means that people like who are non-binary or fall outside of just some of those categories, can they attend? Can they not attend? It's a little bit more
so even some
difficult.
sort of discrimination within the community itself, or not necessarily discrimination, but separation.
Yeah, I would say I haven't necessarily attended any of those events because I just haven't been involved in that so much. But I noticed that was a really interesting thing, that I think so much of Pride in other countries is about bringing the community together and all supporting each other because, of course, we're stronger together. But yeah, I noticed here in Japan there were a lot more specific events, and maybe that makes people feel comfortable in their own way, being with a smaller group of people. But I thought that was an interesting difference.
Do you think there's a specific reason for that? You just mentioned it may make people feel more comfortable to be with a smaller group of people. And if we rewind this a little bit, we know that the acceptance or recognition of the community in Japan, from what we learned from discussing this with Chari and talking about this with you a little bit off camera, a lot of people maybe struggle to come out, struggle to discuss who they are and how they want to live their life. And that community may be a bit overwhelming for them as a whole, right? So do you think that's one of the reasons for this separation for 4G or 4L, or is there something else behind it?
I think that could be a part of it. I'm not entirely sure what the actual reason is, but yeah, my guess would be that if you go to an event like that, you're going because you want to be surrounded by people who are sharing this same experience as you, not just queer people in general, but people who really, are experiencing some of the same things. So in that way, it could be a very close-knit community. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the reasoning for that is. I do wish sometimes that there were more inclusive events, and I think there are just events like that are increasing in general. But yeah, I have noticed that separation.
I think we're going to talk a lot more about events a little bit later in this episode. One thing I wanted to ask you now is, how is the media perception of this community, right? So we know the government stance. We see there is a community that is not necessarily as united as you said it is in the United States. What is the media portrayal of the LGBTQ community here in Japan? Yeah,
I think there's still a long way to go in terms of media portrayal as well. I think in recent years it's improving, and especially with social media, it's a lot easier for people to gain more visibility. But definitely in the past, there are LGBTQ personalities on Japanese TV. Many Japanese TV shows have these talent who are, TV personalities who show up often on many shows and comedy shows and things. But the large majority of them were transgender women, and they kind of used their gender identity as their joke, essentially. It was a very flat character half the time.
So it's a character.
Yeah, I think many of them, have... In some ways, it was good because it's increased visibility and awareness in general, but I don't think it was on a very deep level. And I think there was a lot of that playing into that Okama stereotype here in Japan. And so there, in the past, there hasn't been great media representation. More recently, I think, there is an increase in the younger generation. I don't watch all that much TV, so I'm not sure who's on TV now. But for example, from Kobe, I believe, there's a band called Queen Bee, Jobachi, and their lead singer is, I believe, non-binary or under the trans umbrella. And it's great to see someone like that, being in popular media these days.
So if that's popular media not so discussed, and so what about social media then?
Social media too. I think, for example, artists like that have really taken off on social media. I believe there's one other social media, I think he's an influencer called Cameo, who I know I have some friends who are a fan of him. It's interesting to note that both Avu-chan from Queen Bee and Cameo are also both half Japanese and half from
as far as I know, Cameo still lives in New York or is moving back and forth between New York and kind of very active and kind of being a role model a little bit for the community.
But it's great to have role models like that in the community.
Is this something that's changing? Are there more and more? And is this leading a younger generation to kind of be more open about it? Or is still like a long way to go?
I think there's a long way to go, but overall, I'm seeing that the younger generation especially seems pretty accepting. I think it's still very hard for many Japanese people to come out. But in general, I think the more that we can have people on social media being role models, it's a great place to start the conversation and just increase awareness. I think a lot of the problem here in Japan is also just that there's not that much awareness. Many people, like sometimes I'll talk to people who will be like, oh, I've never met a gay person before or something like that. So I think there's a lot of people that they don't even know that statistically it's very likely that they do know some LGBTQ people, but there's just not that awareness and openness in many ways.
So when you're in that situation and you meet someone who says, oh, I've never met a gay person in my life, how does the conversation go? How do you begin to explain?
That's a good question.
What it is, what it stands for, and what it means for you.
Yeah. So personally, I identify as bisexual, and I generally just say that I like who I like. But if I need to pick a label, I usually use bisexual. I use the definition of that. That's also sometimes considered the same as pansexual, which is that you like people of the same gender as yourself and people of other genders. I just tend to use the term bisexual because it gets across really easily in both English and Japanese. And if I'm needing to put a label on myself, the whole point of having a label is to just convey the point really quickly. So that's what I use for myself. And when I've brought that up with Japanese people, they go, oh, okay, they've heard of that before. Some of them have been, curious and asked me more about what that means for me. But yeah, I've been lucky to not really have any negative experiences that way here in Japan, in terms of people directly being discriminatory when I've come out to them in that way. I think there are other ways in which I've experienced some discrimination, but not face to face. They're usually like, okay, or they just move on with the conversation.
So maybe that's something interesting we can touch upon, the ways you've perhaps faced discrimination. But I think just before we jump into that, I was curious. LGBTQ comes from lesbian, gay, transgender, and the English vocabulary.
Yes.
But the term LGBTQ has been kind of used worldwide, but based on the English vocabulary.
Yes.
How does it apply in the Japanese context? Do they have specific words? Do they use English words? Or how is this used in Japan?
That's a good question. So in Japanese, most of the words are the same as the English ones. They're just used in katakana, so we pronounce them similarly
Japanese
to
way,
English. Yeah. I think, are there any other special terms? For instead of non-binary, they say X-gender. So that term is different. Most of the other ones, I think, are about the same as the English. Although I think in English, gay can be kind of an umbrella term. Like even I will just say that I'm gay sometimes to just convey that queer part of my identity. But in Japan, gay very specifically means gay men only. You cannot use gay to talk about a woman, for example, where in English, I think it's a lot more flexible.
So do you think it's interesting because then that means they use words from English, foreign words, to describe something that's universal, but that they don't have their own words to understand this. So how do you think this has perhaps a negative impact on the understanding of the people here in Japan of the LGBTQ community, because they're using foreign concepts to describe something. So they already don't know the English word. They don't know the English definition and what it really means. Suddenly they use it with the Japanese pronunciation, but they don't have anything to associate that word with. So if someone introduces them, I'm transgender.
That's a good question. I think those words have been in the vocabulary for long enough that most people have a general understanding of what they mean. So I don't think that's really an issue. And I think there are Japanese words that can be used to explain those situations. I think the katakana is just more common, just the way that like you can use either ringo or apuru to talk about apple juice. I don't think people really have any specific association with that, but yeah, it's definitely something to think about. It is a lot of terminology and maybe overwhelming for people who aren't, used to hearing about it. I mean, I think the same goes for English. A lot of people are like, what are all these words? Education is important.
Let's now move on to some of the challenges the community face, because I think this is one of the key points we want to discuss today in terms of it's a minority community here that doesn't get too much exposure, and when it does get exposure, it's not always under the right light, right? So could you maybe share some of your personal experiences? You mentioned you faced some discriminations. What are the typical challenges you have had here in Japan?
I think the biggest challenge that comes to mind would be apartment searching. So when I was searching for an apartment with my former partner, who is also female, we definitely ran into some problems with trying to get an apartment together as a couple, because many of the real estate agencies were like, we don't do share houses. You can't do a share house. And we were like trying to explain, no, we're a couple. We're not two friends sharing a house. And we actually had someone say, but what if one of you gets a boyfriend and wants to move out? And we're like, that's not
how it works.
That's not on the table right here. So, I think that was definitely with some older real estate agents who maybe weren't as open-minded, but I think that's a problem. Many people classify it, if you're a same-sex couple, as being a share house situation all of a sudden, and not seeing it as a couple or family situation.
Has this happened for like several apartments, or?
This happened with... I think a few places that we looked until we found a real estate agent who was very open-minded, had studied abroad in San Francisco, and was like, oh yeah, I've helped a gay couple before, I can help you too. So
awesome. Yeah. So you did find a place.
We did find a place, and it was a good place. But I think that's a struggle that many people run into when searching for an apartment. Are
there other culturally specific challenges that you would say the LGBTQ community faces here in Japan? Definitely.
One of the big barriers to same-sex marriage here is the Japanese family registry system. And they have this very complex system that's, to track who is, I suppose, part of what family. And when you get married, you move into the family register of the person who you're marrying. And because of this, Japan has great records for, past family histories.
Generations can be traced back to where they're from.
It's amazing. That is a really cool thing about it. But the problem with this is that they do not know how to handle a couple who has two different last names and doesn't want to change their last name. Now, this has been a problem not only for LGBTQ couples, but for straight couples as well. If someone doesn't want to change their name, you cannot get married in Japan. Both the people in the couple have to have the same name. So even for a straight couple, the man can change his name to the woman's last name. That's okay here. But they have to have the same name.
There is... So this applies to two Japanese nationals, right? But
yes.
If you are an international couple, I believe you're allowed to keep separate names.
I have a friend who got his name, double name.
Double name.
Yeah, so he's American and she's Japanese. They got double last name, and that way they allowed them both to change.
Only works in an international relationship.
Yes, I believe that for people of Japanese nationality, they have to have the same last name. That's interesting to know that there could be exceptions in the case of...
They put together two last names.
So it becomes a new
last name, and they had this new last name.
Yeah, it does seem like there are occasionally some loopholes for foreign and Japanese couples, but it's still nowhere close to allowing marriage. But anyway, the family registry system, because it can't accommodate different last names, that's one of the barriers to same-sex marriage it's been said that that's one of the barriers, and that if we can get that situation figured out, it will open the door to make it easier for couples to get married.
From the outside, it looks not such a difficult door to open,
right?
It
doesn't sound very hard.
It's a tradition that's like centuries old, and for probably traditionalists or more conservative politicians or families, it's a difficult step to make to change.
Yes. Talking to some Japanese friends, I think as foreign people, we think of getting married as just two people, becoming a couple and getting married. But for talking to them, like their dreams of getting married, even from, childhood, dreaming about getting married, a lot of it was thinking about, I'm going to move to this family register or something. Like that's a big part of what marriage means to many people. So I can see why culturally it's a difficult thing to change.
Yeah, family is definitely something very important worldwide in every culture. And do you feel like there's a lot of pressure from families also on maybe younger generation to not be, if I can say it like that, not be LGBTQ or like you have to be straight or.
I think it really depends on the family. I think there is, with just the media nowadays, there is more general awareness, and I think it's probably getting a little bit easier for people to come out. But I know that some people, with their specific family situations, it's still very difficult. So, but I do think that's similar to in America or other places. One way in which it might be different in Japan is that Japan, homophobia and things aren't quite as tied to religion as it might be in some other countries. I know we have a lot of that in America, where the reason for some people's opinions on this comes from their religious beliefs, where in Japan is quite secular. I think it's mostly a lack of understanding and just fear of what that means.
You mentioned Japan is a relatively safe country, and it doesn't see that much violence towards LGBTQ community, but have you witnessed any forms of harassment or kind of abuse?
I have seen some people get a little bit bullied for that, and I've heard stories of workplace bullying as well, relating to that. It's usually, not physically violent, but of course, mentally not a great situation for people to be in. So I do think that there's still a ways to go with that and more protections that need to be put in place for that.
Is it a similar situation in schools as well?
Yes, I mean, Japan already has a problem with this ijime bullying in schools. So I think depending on the school, some people probably have a very difficult time. On the other hand, I think there are some schools that are becoming more open-minded. I think, as you talked about with Chari on a previous episode, so more and more schools are allowing people to wear whatever uniform they feel comfortable with. And
uniforms are still very prevalent here in Japan, and they used to be very women's uniform, men's uniforms, or boys and girls, and of course the girls' uniform always very short skirt, even in winter. Kind of very, very standardized, and that's kind of putting stereotypes.
Definitely.
On
it's reinforced just by the way you look. Sometimes that would be really difficult. But I worked as an English teacher when I first came to Japan, as so many people did. And I heard a story from a student about how they had a transgender student at their school.
Okay.
And the school actually called they call it a school assembly or something, where they gather everyone together for a large meeting. And
we have a situation.
Yeah, essentially. But they explained what that meant, and that this student was going to be wearing the different uniform from now on. And after that, there was no harassment or anything toward that student, and everyone understood and accepted the situation, which I thought was amazing.
Nice.
I feel like it depends on the school. That could really go both ways to really single out this student. But in this situation, it went really well. It was very educational for everyone. And I thought that was a really unique and amazing situation. So hopefully there's more education like that in the future.
So one would hope, based on that story, of course it's one story, and like you said, it could have gone both ways.
Yes.
But it does seem that basically what Japan is really lacking in this regard is just a lot of communication and education, right?
Yes,
the same,
I think so.
Even in the West, if we go back quite a few years ago, there was not so much understanding of what is it. And I also do believe that the community, I mean, I remember growing up and we did talk about gays and lesbians, but transgender, non-binary were not really terms that were used in common language. So it kind of grew LG, and then the LGBT, and then LGBTQ, and now it's LGBTQIA.
Yes,
and
with a plus for even more.
And so the community is becoming more inclusive, and people are being able to express their personal preferences in a maybe more specific way. But I feel like, like you mentioned, Taiwan or the Western countries or other countries in the world are a few steps ahead. And basically what's lacking in Japan is some sort of education.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. Overall, I think many people are open-minded. I think there was a survey, I believe it was already like 4 years ago, the results of this survey that I had seen, but over 60% of people were supportive of the idea of same-sex marriage. But there's just a lack of general understanding of, for example, what the other terms in LGBTQIA plus mean. And then, of course, I think many people in power in the government are not part of this group that's quite so open-minded.
Yeah, they're a little bit older too, right?
Yes.
So it's more tricky.
Yeah, generation gap thing. But I think that, raising awareness and education is always a good step. So
you've been in Japan now quite a few years, 5 years, is that
8.
correct? 8 years.
Or
8
9?
years. 9 years.
9 years
Going
now.
on to 10.
Yes.
So
actually 10 years total if you count the year that I studied abroad before I moved here full time. So
you've experienced Japan for a decade, and you did mention to us, if it's okay to say, that you came out while being in Japan.
Yes, I did.
So how was that experience for you, and how have you seen the community and the perception of the community, and basically what we talked about until now change over this last decade?
That's a good question. So I was still in the closet when I lived in America, and then once I came to Japan, I slowly started figuring myself out, and then reached the point where I was comfortable with sharing that. And it was, even though I knew that my family and friends would be very accepting, it's nerve-wracking, to share that part of yourself and fully accept it for yourself too. And I think for me, speaking both English and Japanese, it was really nice to be able to find resources in Japanese as well to just encourage me and provide me with support and what to expect and everything with the coming out process. So it was really cool having 2 languages worth of resources. But I think we've seen huge progress in Japan during the time that I've been here. The main one being these partnership systems that are popping up across Japan. Right now, 10 of the 47 prefectures in Japan have some kind of partnership system where it's not nearly on the same level as marriage, but it does allow for hospital visitation rights and things like that. So that's really important. I think it
on
has
the local level.
On the local level,
local governments are trying to be more inclusive and like taking steps forward.
Yes, there's also, I think, almost 250 cities that on a city level have some sort of partnership.
Oh, wow, so it goes really down.
It goes really small, Actually, the only place that allows gay marriage is Shibuya, like ward in Tokyo. So not even a city in the ward. But of course, if you leave the ward, it's no longer, recognized. So that's really difficult. But I think seeing the partnership systems expand it's a good start for sure. So hopefully we can have more and more of that. And maybe that will also eventually lead to actual marriage and all the protections that come with marriage to be extended to the LGBTQ community as well.
How, when you decided to kind of come out, you mentioned it was very nice for you to find resources in both languages to kind of help you. Is there some kind of support system here in Japan where people can go for those resources, can go to have someone to talk to express themselves and find maybe like a support group? Yeah,
I think there are some like organizations here. There's some like cafes that cater to the LGBTQ community. There's Osaka has a, what is it called? The Osaka like Human Rights Education Center, I believe it's called in English. They have a very cute mascot who has rainbow hair.
Always a mascot in Japan.
Nikorina, but she's very cute. And I think they provide support or just someone to listen if there's any issues or anything. Other places, well, every year there's an annual Pride event in Osaka, Rainbow Fest or Rainbow Festa, I can't remember. But they also have many booths with places that share resources and support. I think those are some of the main places. For me, my main place was just YouTube.
YouTube,
but
the place to go.
Yeah, but I think there are increasingly more resources out there, and hopefully it will become even easier for people to find those resources.
So a lot of those things are happening in the cities, right?
Yes.
Osaka, Tokyo, you mentioned Shibuya-ku, the ward in Tokyo allows same-sex marriage. Is there any big difference if you're like in the countryside in terms of perception, interaction, and...
That's a good question, and I would say it actually really depends where you are, because when I was teaching English, I lived in the countryside in Kagawa Prefecture in Shikoku, down in the south part of Japan, on a different island.
Birthplace of udon noodles.
Yes, nothing but udon everywhere you go, like seriously. But that within Kagawa Prefecture, there's a small town called Mitoyo that was actually one of the first places to recognize same-sex partnerships, because some couples from there fought really hard for that. So even though it was the countryside, there was definitely some acceptance, and I made many LGBTQ friends there through the cosplay community. Actually, we could get into that more later. But so Kagawa, despite being the smallest prefecture population-wise in Japan, or smallest prefecture in area, I think, in Japan.
Possible, yeah. It's not very, very large.
Yeah, it's very small, but it was a fairly accepting place to be. While on the other hand, I've heard that Nagano Prefecture, despite having some very large cities, is much more conservative. So I think, it's interesting. You would expect the rural areas to be much more conservative, but it sounds like it's a little bit more regional.
Depends where you are. If you're stuck in the mountains, maybe a little bit more.
Maybe that's why. They are in the mountains over there.
From everything.
Yeah.
Awesome. So it does seem like it's different. It really depends on where you are in Japan, and you can find your support groups. So I think this is a good time to start talking about the support circle around the community. And I think there's a lot to talk, because there's a lot of challenges. And you did mention that you found your resources on YouTube, but there are official things available.
Yes.
But what is it that is very important about having support for this community in Japan? And especially maybe we mentioned the strain of keeping a secret, of not living up to who you really feel like you are, and the mental health burden. So what are the mental health support groups, and why is it important to develop this here in Japan?
Yes, I think that's very important to develop support systems, because after a while, not coming out starts weighing on you, and every little thing starts building up. And I think it's so much healthier to be able to live as you are. Like I said, there's those resources here. And I think other than those resources, I'm not too aware of what.
So it's still quite limited, right? Yeah,
I think it is still a bit limited. I hope that there's more. I know here in English-speaking resources, there are some like helplines or places that you can call to have someone listen, but and they share often information about those at the Pride events. But I do think that it is a little bit limited. Japan's support for mental health in general is a little bit limited, so I think we have a ways to go for that, specifically for the LGBT community as well.
What about the, let's say, less official channels of support, and the more maybe someone who struggles personally might not want to go directly to talk to a professional that can provide help, but might just want to turn to a friend or turn to a community like the LGBTQ community. How is a community, or what is a community doing to kind of help each other? Because we talked at the beginning of the show that sometimes there's events just for gays, just for lesbians. How does a community build a support system to kind of push each other up, like it's seen often in the United States?
That's a really good question, and I do wish that I had an answer for that. I have to say that I don't really have a clear answer for that, because I've found my LGBT community within the cosplay community here, which is, I thought was really interesting, because it's the same in the US and in many other countries.
So how do they overlap?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap there. The cosplay community, I think, tends to be very welcoming. There's already a lot of gender bending going on with people cosplaying all different characters. And so it's not strange to cosplay a character of a different gender. It's not strange to act a way that maybe defies gender norms. And so that's a really safe space to do that and kind of experiment with that. And I think that there are a lot of people that are drawn to that feeling of freedom within the cosplay community. And so when I was living in Shikoku and cosplaying really actively, like going to events every weekend, I had a lot of LGBTQ friends who I didn't even realize at first. We were just friends and we got to talking more. And I was like, wow, like half of my community is also LGBTQ. That was really surprising to me. But yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap because it is such an open and welcoming community in that way.
Has this helped you personally?
Oh yeah, definitely. It was great to, have some role models. Some of them were much older than me, and just see more LGBTQ people, living their lives and everything. So I think that's one way in which we can help younger LGBTQ people is
get
just
them to cosplay.
Get them to cosplay. But just the more positive examples we see, it's great. Yeah.
From talking to all your friends in the cosplay community that are also part of the LGBTQ community, do you notice a lot of similar experiences and similar challenges? You mentioned, of course, we talked about marriage, but like you mentioned, apartment hunting. You mentioned, getting recognition and rights. Do you feel like they have similar stories to share? Is it always kind of a repeat button of everyone facing the exact same situation?
I think some of them were a little bit more closeted about it than I have been. So I haven't necessarily talked to them quite about all the details of that, what that means for them. But I have heard from other people that, there are similar experiences with apartment hunting and things. So I know that there is a big push that we'll eventually get more equal rights here. Yeah.
So we talked about the public sphere a lot, but I want to ask you a little bit about the workplace. You mentioned that it happens that some people get mentally harassed at work for being different. And how was your experience? You worked as a teacher before at school, so you're in front of children, and more conservative parents or more conservative school boards might take issue with your position or you being part of the LGBTQ community. Now you work as a
web designer.
Yeah, you're a web designer. How was it for you in terms of like the work environment? Do you see support from employers? Do you have to keep your personal life hidden in a way from your coworkers, or are they?
Yeah, so at my English teaching job, it was a very small eikaiwa school, not an actual school. And at that point, I was still in the closet. Okay. So I didn't have that come up. But when I was working at my previous company doing web design, I did bring it up a few times, but it was very much just pushed to the side and continued. I don't feel like I necessarily received any direct discrimination from that, but it was just not a great workplace environment in general. So I think other things kind of overshadowed that. Now I'm lucky to be in a place where I feel comfortable to express myself. But the story that I hear from many people is that there are some companies where you could be discriminated against, even transferred to another branch or something if people don't like you. There are definitely some stories out there.
What are the types of harassment or stories that you've heard that you could maybe share with us to get a better understanding of what are some of the potential challenges that people could face in the workplace and how to stand up against them? What are the rights that are there to protect?
Yeah, I think there unfortunately aren't that many protections in place. I think what would really happen is you'd get ostracized from the group and some companies and just not treated in the same way as your coworkers. I have heard some stories from people about that. And that's, a really terrible situation to be in. But I do think that there are more and more workplaces that are trying to take steps towards being more LGBTQ friendly. And recently there's a recruiting site even called Job Rainbow that is focused towards LGBTQ people. And so companies that go out of their way to list themselves on this site, that's a really clear indicator that that's a safe place for people to work. And I think they even have like little hashtags under the job postings, like this one is, maybe you have LGBTQ senpai, like older people who are working in that company who, are already out. So it's less of a struggle
That's
to come
awesome.
out or things like that. So I think that really increases visibility. And then just the general move in many workplaces from going from like suits and really formal outfits or even uniforms in many companies to like being able to wear whatever clothes you want or have whatever hairstyle you want. I think just that opens up the door a lot for LGBTQ people to work more comfortably and be themselves. So yeah, I think there's slowly some steps being taken there.
Is that website Japanese?
It is. It's
Wow.
based in Tokyo. Unfortunately, most of the listings are in Tokyo. I wish we'd have more of the listings in Osaka, but it's a great step forward. That was relatively recent, I think.
It's interesting because from everything we've talked about today, it really seems that from the outside, it's a very conservative country. And if we look at the details of legislation that's preventing the recognition of LGBTQ rights, and if we look at a lot of traditions like the family register that's preventing a move forward in marriage, at the same time we see a lot of grassroots movements that are really achieving change. You mentioned living in a very small town in Kagawa Prefecture, Mitoyo.
Yes.
That was the first country to actually do something about this. We mentioned the courts in major cities, Nagoya, Sapporo, and Osaka, no, Fukuoka, that were also allowing, saying that it's not constitutional, kind of putting the government in an awkward position. So we see grassroots movements, a job website.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to do it. We're going to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
So do you think there's any chances, now you've experienced the change of the community for the past decade, that in the next decade we see acceleration of those changes and maybe even legalization of marriage countrywide and like a big step forward?
I am really hopeful for those changes. And I think seeing the momentum that it's had over the last 10 or even 5 years, I think it's really likely that we're heading in that direction. Hopefully within the next 5 years, definitely within the next 10. But I think another group that's been pushing a lot is Marriage for All Japan, which is a organization made up by a bunch of couples who have been doing these lawsuits, like in Nagoya and those other cities, to try to say that, yes, this is not constitutional. And they have been making amazing progress on that as we're finally starting to see the results. They've been working on this for a few years now.
And public opinion is on their side, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Right? More than 60% of the population was in favor of this change. And
So I think it's important to continue showing support to those groups and everything, because they are working very hard to make those changes. But I'm optimistic that within the next 10 years, but I'm hoping the next 5 that we'll get there.
yeah. So what would you say now to someone who is already part of the LGBTQ community and open about it and thinking about moving to Japan to become an English teacher or to just work, or someone that perhaps is living in Japan and closeted and struggling? What kind of advice or recommendations would you give to them to make it easier?
Yeah. For someone who's already open about it, I would say that Japan is a place where you'll probably feel safe. You might have some uncomfortable interactions once in a while. You might have to explain your identity to some people who just honestly don't know and understand. But overall, I think you can be safe living here, and that's a really good feeling compared to so many other places in the world right now. For somebody who's still in the closet, I would say the community here might not seem as big and visible as in some other places, but we are here and there are some resources if you can look for them. But I would encourage them to try to find their community, whether that's within the obviously LGBTQ community or within some other niche like the cosplay community, and find what works for them and friends to support them. And I hope they can eventually live in whatever way makes them the most comfortable.
Are there perhaps any events to start with? You mentioned Pride Fest or Pride Festa. I think Chari on the previous episode mentioned some movie festival, film festival.
Oh yes, there's a movie festival here in Kansai, and then I believe it's in October every year. There's the Rainbow Fest, which is a a fun event which has the parade and everything. So yeah, I would recommend that's a good place to start, get some resources, maybe make some friends. And I think they distribute a lot of information about other events going on. So that's could be a really good gateway for some people. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Klepto, for sharing all your insights
You're
into
very
the
welcome.
LGBTQ community
Actually,
in
have
Japan.
one other random fact, I guess,
Please
that
share.
didn't come up, but I think is really interesting, which is that so with the lack of same-sex marriage here, that means that inheritance has been a big problem in the past.
How so?
Because if you and your partner are together for a long time, but maybe you die, there's no way for your possessions and things to pass to this person because
Is
there's
it not
no
possible to just have a will where you donate?
You might be able to, yeah, but there's no family link in that way. So the very interesting and totally unlike anything I've heard of in another country loophole around this is to adopt your partner. That is
Adopt your
something
partner.
that has happened here in Japan as a way to get around this lack of same-sex marriage. So whoever is the older partner will sometimes adopt the younger partner so that they show up in the same family register.
So it's not possible to marry, but you can adopt a person that's 1 year younger than you as a fully grown adult and independent adult.
Right? Isn't that
be
a
your
crazy
child.
loophole? Yeah. So
Wow.
that has been one way that people have gotten around that.
Thank you for sharing that
Yeah.
fact. We would have missed on a very interesting...
I realized that didn't
I
come
think
up. But
it's somehow typical of Japan in a way.
Yeah.
Whatever you can't do, there's always some kind of interesting loophole to go
Yeah.
around it.
yeah.
Is there maybe anything else that I didn't ask that you would have liked to share today about the
I think
LGBTQ
that was the
community?
main one. I just thought that was a really interesting fact
Yeah.
and wanted to make sure we snuck that one into the episode.
That's the good random fact. And
Adopting your husband or wife.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
I think you have a few more facts for us with your typical quiz, Andrew.
Yes, I do. You know the rules already.
We know
I'm
the
asking
rules.
3
We know the
questions.
rules.
The answer is a number. You already talked about one of my answers, so I will start with this question. How many people in Japan support same-sex marriage? According to the most recent study
The most
conducted
recent.
this
Most
year.
recent. Okay.
In percentage, please.
Percentage. Okay. I have
What would be the closest?
a guess.
All right, I've got my number written down.
Okay, Klepto first.
I'm going to hope it's 72%.
Okay.
I wrote 65.
You're more pessimistic. It's 71%.
Oh,
Wow.
very close.
That is I was being on the optimistic side because I thought it was probably going to be just a little over 60%. So I'm happy to hear that.
Well, we don't know how many people participate, but it's a clear majority.
Yeah, that's the main thing.
It seems like the numbers that you were referring to, 64.8% was in 2021, which is 2 years ago.
It's growing.
Yeah, that sounds about
That's
right.
good.
Yeah.
It's good, positive.
Okay, let's turn to the world. How many countries in the world allow same-sex marriage?
Oh, that's a good question.
Wow.
I used to know this at one point, and I haven't kept
I know
track in
that-
the last few years.
Which country was it? Recently, Uganda, that made some very harsh laws against. Maybe I'm wrong.
It was on
if
the
I'm
news,
wrong,
I
please
think.
beep it out.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I
how
feel like
many in the
there's-
world?
Oh,
I'm gonna put a.
How many countries in the world are allowing
allowing.
same-sex marriage?
Okay.
Okay, Toby? Small number.
Small number. I'm going to say 35.
35 and
I'll put
Toby?
21.
That's 34 is the
So
answer.
wow.
Wow, I've been
Close.
really close. I'm only one
You're
off.
really good at
yeah.
this.
Okay, so I
Yeah.
just need to pick my answer and then
And then
choose
move it
one
up
less.
or down.
Yeah.
Yeah. This time,
yeah.
you need to move on.
34 countries. Well,
Oh,
if you think-
35,
Yeah.
minus 1.
Yeah, 35 minutes.
1.3 billion people live in those countries, so it's 1.3 billion people have right to get married to the same sex, which is 16.9% of world's population only. Less than 20% can get married with same sex.
That's not a lot.
Yeah, that's small.
Okay, the last question. Also, the most recent survey in Japan, back to Japan, how many people in Japan identify as a sexual minority?
Oh, okay.
Shari gave us a number. Is it the number or is it the percentage?
Percentage?
Percentage. Oh my God. I know the fraction, but not the percentage. Hold on. I'm really bad at math. Fitting right into those gay stereotypes. Man.
Cherry, I'm counting on you. I hope that your number was correct.
I think that
This is a
okay.
percent.
Let's
Percent?
percentage.
Okay.
Yeah. How many-
Wow.
Okay.
What's your answer?
9%?
9%?
Did you
Toby?
initially think 10 and then scale it down? Or did you think 9 and
No.
scale it down to 8?
I remember hearing a statistic about 1 in 11 a couple of years
Okay.
ago. So I'm trying to figure out what percentage
Oh.
one out divided by
So,
11 is.
but you have to go one down according to your
Then
logic.
it'd be like, I don't know, 8.7 or something. We're just
Okay.
going to go with
I
9%.
have 2%.
Why do you have 2%?
Because I believe that it was mentioned in previous that 2% of the world population identifies as part of the LGBTQ community.
Oh,
Yeah.
Something like that. I don't have the...
But surprisingly, that we are talking about Japan not allowing gay marriage or same-sex marriage, there are 8.9% of people who identify as sexual
told
minorities.
it
You
was
scale it
literally
down.
my answer minus a little bit. Wow, that's crazy.
Yes, 8.9%.
8.9.
I think you've gotten 3 very close and that never happened before.
Yeah, that's
that's
pretty
really, really
good.
close.
If we
and
had
all
a
of them.
prize, you would have won. But
Oh, thank you.
unfortunately,
I won the prize of being
Maybe
able
in
to
your
talk to you
fish and
two
rice
again.
mug.
yeah.
Oh, yes, please. I love your logo design and I would just, you should make merch. I would like
If
it.
you want the mugs in mass production, we need to
We need to
let
order
us
them.
know in the
I
comments.
want the t-shirt. It's so
Yeah.
cool.
Maybe in the future.
We should do
Who
that.
knows?
Okay, that's all from me.
Thank you, Klepto.
Thank you.
This
It
was very interesting, and once again, you shared a lot of very interesting facts with us. And I hope that, as for some of our listeners, now the LGBTQ community challenges are a bit more clear here in Japan, and also perhaps for those part of the LGBTQ who identify as LGBTQ, who are looking for a community, they now have an idea of where to look for support and what to do, especially here in Osaka and the Kansai area. So thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. This is the best way I could have celebrated Pride Month is by sharing this information.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to be here.
All right. Thank you everyone for listening
Thank
today.
you.
This was Fish and Rice Stories from Japan. See you again next week.
Bye.
Bye.